All right, diving in today, folks, to a real head scratcher.
Oh, yeah. One for the ages.
Perfect goodness.
Been keeping philosophers up at night forever, I bet.
But not just good in, like, a general sense.
Right.
We're talking about, like, a being.
Yeah.
The absolutely perfect kind.
Yeah.
The God kind. What does it even mean for them to be perfectly good?
Deep stuff. And that's what we're here for.
Exactly. This is going to be a real workout for those philosophical muscles.
Listeners are going to come out of this sharp. Real sharp.
So today's deep dive, we are tackling perfect goodness.
Specifically, as it applies to an absolutely perfect being.
And to do that, well, we are going to be drawing on a fantastic resource.
Yeah, a classic. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
The CEFP, as we call it.
Always a solid starting point.
Always. No, we're not just summarizing the article, though.
No. We're going to really dig in.
Pick it apart, analyze it.
Connect it back to you, the listener.
Exactly. So strap in.
Yeah.
Get ready for a deep dive into perfect goodness.
And all the philosophical knots that come with it.
So first things first, what are we even talking about here? What is perfect goodness?
Yeah, it sounds pretty self-explanatory, right?
Perfect good.
But there's actually some subtle but important distinctions to make right off the bat.
Because, yeah, initially, I think most people would probably think, okay, perfect goodness, it just means the ultimate level of, like, all the good stuff.
Right, all the good-making properties.
If it makes something good, this being has it maxed out.
Full throttle.
The absolute limit.
Exactly.
So is that basically it?
Well, that's definitely one way to think about it. And actually, as the SAPE article points out, some philosophers do equate perfect goodness with just, like, absolute perfection, period.
So everything perfect.
Everything perfect. But for our purposes today, and really for a lot of modern philosophical theology, we're going to be focusing on a slightly narrower view.
Okay.
We're looking at perfect goodness as a specific perfection.
One amongst many, then.
Exactly. It's not just perfection in general. It's a particular attribute.
So it's like, you've got your omniscience, right? Knowing everything.
Right.
You've got your omnipotence, all-powerful. And then alongside those,
you have perfect goodness.
as its own thing.
Yeah, like a separate item on the divine resume.
Okay, so then what does this specific flavor of perfect goodness look like? What are we really talking about here?
Well, a lot of the recent work, especially when you look at stuff about the problem of evil, it frames perfect goodness as this kind of practical excellence.
Practical, not just like theoretical.
Right. It's less about like abstract principles and more about how a being is oriented in the world.
So what they desire.
Their character, how they act.
So a perfectly good being would have like the best possible desires.
The best possible desire.
An impeccable character.
Flawless.
And actions that are just like top tier good.
In a word, yeah, unsurpassable goodness.
I like that. Unsurpassable. So it's not just that they're good at doing good things. It's that they are good, like inherently.
At the core.
And that goodness is expressed through their actions, through their choices.
Right. And the article uses this term agency to kind of capture all of that. The desires, the character, the actions. So basically, a morally perfect being has morally unsurpassable agency.
Okay. So we're zeroing in on moral goodness here, but, and I know this is like philosophy 101, but how are we even defining moral goodness in the first place?
Oh, man. You're hitting on like the biggest question in ethics right there.
Yeah, exactly. Because if we're going to say a being is perfectly morally good, we kind of have to agree on what morally good even means.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And our source, the Cefic article, it acknowledges this head on. It's like,
Okay.
look, we're not going to solve all of meta-ethics and normative ethics in this one little section.
Fair enough.
Because those are huge, sprawling fields of philosophy.
Yeah. Each deserving their own deep dive, probably.
Multiple deep dives.
So what are we working with then? What are the like ground rules for how we're thinking about moral goodness in this context?
Okay, so the article points out a couple of key assumptions that are pretty much baked into these kinds of discussions.
Okay.
First one is that there actually is some objective truth about how morally good an agent's actions are.
So not just like everyone's opinion is equally valid.
Right. There's some actual standard out there.
Yeah.
And second, though the details are obviously super debated, the kind of moral goodness we're usually talking about here is what you might call the welfare-oriented kind.
Okay, so like well-being matters.
Yeah, well-being matters. Actions that promote well-being are good. Actions that diminish it are bad. And this applies, at the very least, to humans. probably to other sentient beings too.
Okay, so we're not talking about some totally alien concept of goodness that has nothing to do with how we think about morality.
Right, right. And it reminds me of that point that John Stuart Mill made, the one that the article brings up.
Yeah.
That if God's goodness means something completely different from our understanding of goodness, then the word just loses all meaning.
It's like, what are we even talking about then?
Exactly. And it gets to the heart of why people are so concerned about the problem of evil.
Right, because if God's goodness could somehow allow for all that suffering, it'd be a pretty empty concept.
A contradiction in terms, almost. So, yeah, we're working with a definition of perfect goodness that's about unsurpassable moral agency.
Rooted in this idea of promoting well-being.
Right.
Okay, so we've got our working definition. Now, the article raises this really interesting question about, well, the nature of this goodness.
Uh-huh.
Is it necessary or contingent?
Ah, yes. The modal status of perfect goodness. A philosopher's favorite playground.
Gotta love those modalities. So break this down for me. Necessary versus contingent. What's the difference here?
Okay, so if something is necessary, it means it couldn't be any other way. It's true in every possible world, no matter what. Like 2 + 2 = 4. That's necessary.
Right. No matter what weird alternate reality you dream up, 2 + 2 is going to equal 4.
Exactly. But contingent things, they're true in our world, but they could have been different. Like the fact that I'm wearing this blue shirt today, that's contingent.
You could have worn a green one.
I could have worn a green
Yeah.
one. Yeah. So when we're talking about perfect goodness being necessary or contingent, we're asking, is God's perfect goodness just a fact about our world, or is it built into the very essence of God, true in every possible world?
Okay, so I think I'm getting this. So if God is necessarily perfectly good, then it means in every possible world, in every conceivable scenario, God is perfectly good, no exceptions.
That's it. It's like, even if you imagine a world where everything else is different, the laws of physics are different, the history of the universe is different, God is still perfectly good in that world.
And if it's contingent, it's like in our world, God happens to be perfectly good,
Right.
but in some other possible world, maybe not so much.
Maybe not.
Okay. So which one is it? Is perfect goodness necessary or contingent?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? And there's some really strong philosophical arguments on both sides.
Lay on me.
Okay, so starting with the case for necessary perfect goodness. I think the most intuitive argument is that a perfection that's necessary is just like a greater perfection than one that's contingent.
Okay, I can see that. It's like if you're good in every possible situation, that's more impressive than just being good in this one particular situation.
Exactly. And this line of thinking, it mirrors the arguments for God's necessary omniscience and omnipotence.
So, like, if knowing stuff is good, knowing everything is even better. And if knowing everything in this world is good, knowing everything in every possible world is even better than that.
Right. So if perfect goodness is a perfection, then having it necessarily would seem to be the ultimate way to have it.
The most perfect way to be perfectly good.
Right. But, and this is where things get really interesting, there's this counter-argument that says, hold on, maybe the whole idea of necessary perfect goodness just doesn't make sense.
Like it's a contradiction in terms.
Potentially. There might be some underlying conceptual problem with combining necessary and perfect goodness that we don't run into when we're just talking about perfect goodness on its own.
Okay, so walk me through that. How could the idea of necessary perfect goodness be incoherent?
Well, one way to think about it is that maybe the very pinnacle of perfect goodness is for a being to possess it, even though it's logically possible for them not to.
So, like, they could be not good, but they choose to be good.
Yeah, and some philosophers who are really into perfect being theology, they even say that attributing perfections only contingently kind of misses the point of perfect being theology.
Interesting.
Like, they might argue that if you're trying to do things like provide a priori arguments for God's existence, like Anselm's famous ontological argument, those arguments are a lot weaker if divine perfections are just contingent facts.
Right, because then it's like God might exist, but it wouldn't be an essential part of God's being to be absolutely perfect.
Right, and to some people that just doesn't seem very godlike.
Yeah, it makes God's goodness seem kind of accidental. Like, oh, well, God just happens to be good in this particular universe. Lucky us.
Exactly. And the article even mentions how some philosophers find this whole idea of a contingently perfectly good being kind of absurd.
Absurd.
Yeah, because it raises this really unsettling possibility that God could like one day, decide to be less than perfectly good.
Which would kind of throw a wrench in traditional conceptions of God, to say the least.
Yeah, it would kind of undermine the whole God is all good thing.
Right. But the article does offer a response to this worry, right?
It does. It basically says, look, even if God's perfect goodness is contingent, that doesn't mean we can't know that it currently holds, and maybe even that it always will.
Okay.
And there's also this idea that perfect goodness, at least for an absolutely perfect being, might be what you call a stable property.
Stable meaning?
Meaning that if God has it at any point in a given possible world, God has it at all times in that world.
So even if it's not logically necessary in every single possible world, it could still be a permanent, unchanging feature of any world where God exists.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
The article even uses this analogy, comparing it to the necessary identity of water in H2O.
Okay, yeah, I remember this. Like, even if it turned out that water wasn't necessarily H2O, that wouldn't change the fact that water is H2O in our world.
Right. So in the same way, even if the idea of necessary perfect goodness is ultimately flawed, contingent perfect goodness could still be a totally valid and maximal attribute. Like if the highest form of perfect goodness you can have is contingent perfect goodness, then a being who is actually morally perfect isn't somehow lacking just because that perfection isn't a logical necessity.
Okay, I see that. It's like it's still the best possible version of perfect goodness, even if it's not necessary.
Exactly. And the article also mentions briefly these alternative views where God is either essentially morally perfect or essentially morally defective.
Essentially.
Yeah, like as part of their very being. So those views, they kind of sidestep this whole necessity versus contingency debate.
Okay, fascinating stuff. So much to think about. But I guess the next big question is, regardless of whether it's necessary or contingent, is perfect goodness actually a thing out there in the world?
Right. We've been talking about concepts, possibilities, but now we're moving into the realm of reality.
Like, does a being who actually embodies this perfect goodness, this unsurpassable moral agency focused on well-being, actually exist?
That's the question.
Yeah.
And the article makes this important point that it's not just about whether any random being out there happens to be perfectly good.
Right.
It's about whether a being exists who's perfectly good and who also possesses all the other perfections we usually attribute to God.
Like omniscience and omnipotence.
Exactly. And it even hints at this idea that maybe these perfections are all interconnected, that maybe they even presuppose each other.
Okay, so like maybe you can't have perfect goodness without omniscience because you need to know everything to make perfectly good choices.
Right. Or maybe you can't have omnipotence without perfect goodness, because otherwise you could use that unlimited power for evil.
Right.
So, yeah, answering the question of whether perfect goodness is actually exemplified would require us to, dive into all the classical arguments for God's existence. The ontological argument, cosmological argument, teleological argument, the moral argument.
And all the counter arguments too, of course.
Of course.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, that's a whole other deep dive, or 10 deep dives.
A series of deep dives. But the article does highlight one major challenge, this idea that perfect goodness is actually out there in the world, right?
Yeah, the big one. The argument from evil.
Of course.
Yeah.
The classic philosophical showdown. So, remind everyone, what's the gist of the argument from evil?
Okay, so it basically says that the existence of evil in the world, all the suffering, all the bad stuff, is incompatible with the existence of a God who's omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good.
Right, because if God knows everything, can do anything, and is perfectly good, then why is there so much suffering?
Exactly. That's the standard version of the argument.
The classic formulation.
But the article also brings up this more subtle and maybe even stronger claim.
Okay, what's that?
That even if God had some justifiable reason for creating a world with evil in it, God might still fall short of perfect goodness simply because God's actions caused those bad things to exist in the first place.
Oh, okay. I see the distinction. It's not just about allowing evil to happen. It's about actually being the source of evil.
Exactly. And they use this analogy of an executive who has to lay off workers.
Oh, yeah, I remember this.
Even if it's the most responsible choice in a bad economic situation, the executive is still the one causing harm.
Right.
So does that somehow make them morally compromised?
Interesting question. So how do we square that with the idea of perfect goodness?
Well, the article suggests that maybe we need to look at moral goodness, not just in terms of outcomes, but also in terms of like the agent's overall orientation towards value and how they respond to the complexities of their situation.
So it's not just about whether bad stuff happens, but about why it happens and how the agent is trying to navigate that.
Right. They argue that criticizing God's actions solely because bad things exist in the world is kind of a simplistic view of morality.
It's like saying, well, if you were truly good, nothing bad would ever happen.
Right, which just isn't realistic.
Yeah, especially if you're an all-powerful being who's responsible for, like, the entire universe.
Exactly. So, yeah, it's a really nuanced discussion, and it gets to the heart of what it means to be morally good in a complex world.
All right, so we've tackled the question of whether perfect goodness actually exists out there in the world. But now we've got to get even more meta.
Oh, yeah. Things are about to get real philosophical.
Buckle up, listeners, because we're going to tackle the question of whether perfect goodness is even possible at all.
Right. Not just whether it exists, but whether it could even exist in principle.
Whether the very concept makes sense. And my initial reaction is like, of course it's possible. We have ideals of moral excellence, right? Surely those are coherent.
Right. We talk about things we ought to do. So doesn't that imply that we can do them? Like if we're morally obligated to be good, then the concept of moral goodness has to be a real possibility.
Exactly.
But the article brings up this really interesting idea that maybe moral standards aren't about achieving some fixed, absolute ideal, but rather about creating a comparative ordering.
Okay, so instead of saying this is the perfect moral action, we're saying this action is morally better than that one.
Right. Morality is about ranking options, not about reaching some ultimate peak.
Okay, I can see that.
And if that's the case, then the idea of perfect moral goodness, like the absolute top rank, becomes a lot less obvious. Because it could be that for any action we consider morally good, there's always a conceivable better action.
So there's always room for improvement.
There's always room for improvement. And this is where we get to the famous no best world scenario.
Oh, yeah. Gotta love a good thought experiment.
So imagine God has this infinite set of possible worlds to choose from when creating the universe. And now imagine that for every world God could create, there's another possible world that's morally superior in some way.
So, like, no matter which world God chooses, there's always a better option out there.
Always a better option. And since God can only choose one world, any world God creates will inevitably be less than the absolute best morally.
Okay, I'm following so far.
So the argument goes, by choosing a world that's not the absolute best, even if it's a really, really good world, God's act of creation isn't perfectly good.
And therefore, God's agency falls short of perfect goodness.
That's the conclusion, yeah. And the article does a good job of laying out the different responses to this argument. Like, Leibniz famously argued that since God is perfectly rational, the world God created must be the best of all possible worlds. But others, like Rowe and Wielenberg, they've used the no best world scenario as an argument against God's existence.
Right.
So, yeah, it's a pretty powerful argument, and it really gets you thinking about the relationship between God's actions and the moral value of the world.
It seems like the key sticking point here is the move from the idea that any world God creates will be morally surpassable to the conclusion that God's act of creating that world is also morally surpassable.
Right.
Like, just because world B is morally better than world A, does that automatically mean that creating world B is morally better than creating world A?
That's the question. And the article suggests that maybe we need to distinguish between evaluating a world and evaluating the act of creating that world.
Okay, interesting.
Like maybe evaluating worlds is a third-person thing. We look at the world from the outside and say, okay, which one is morally better? But evaluating actions might be more first-personal, more focused on the agent's own reasons and intentions.
So even if that outcome, the world that's created, isn't the absolute best morally, God's choice to create that world might still be perfectly good, given God's reasons for choosing it.
Exactly. It's all about context, right?
Right. And the article brings up this idea of second-order reasons, which I find fascinating.
Ah, yes. Second-order reasons. Joseph Raz's work on this is really influential.
So basically, second-order reasons are reasons for or against acting on other reasons.
Right. Like, imagine you're trying to decide what to eat for dinner. Your first-order reasons might be things like, I'm hungry, I like pizza, I haven't had pizza in a while.
Okay, makes sense.
But then you might have a second-order reason that says, hey, I should probably eat something healthy tonight, even though I really want pizza.
Right.
So that second-order reason is a reason for or against acting on those first-order reasons.
I get it.
And in the no best world scenario, God might have a second-order reason that says, look, trying to choose a world based solely on which one is morally best it's just going to lead to infinite deliberation. I'll never actually create anything.
Because there's always a better option.
Always a better option. So that second-order reason could justify God choosing a world based on other considerations, even if it's not the absolute best morally. And the article even mentions the idea of, like, just picking a world, which is kind of a radical idea, but it highlights the point that God's choice doesn't have to be based solely on maximizing moral value.
Right.
So, yeah, maybe God's moral perfection lies in the way God responds to all the relevant reasons, including these second-order reasons, not just in the outcome of the choice itself.
Okay, that's a really helpful way to think about it.
It's all about the bigger picture.
So we've explored this idea of perfect goodness being contingent. But now let's circle back to the possibility of necessary perfect goodness.
Right, back to that initial intuition that necessary goodness seems more perfect.
Assuming we can get over the hurdle of whether it's even conceptually coherent.
Right.
What are the philosophical objections to God being necessarily perfectly good?
Okay, so one big objection comes from the work of William Alston. He basically argues that moral norms, like rules about what's right and wrong, only apply to beings who can actually break those rules.
Okay, so it's like if you can't do wrong, then the concept of doing right doesn't really apply to you.
Exactly.
Like, we don't praise a rock for not murdering anyone.
Right. So if God is necessarily perfectly good, if God literally cannot do wrong, then it seems weird to talk about God being morally obligated or praiseworthy.
Because there's no possibility of God failing.
Right.
But the article presents a counter-argument to this, right?
It does. It draws on Immanuel Kant's idea of holy wills.
Holy wills.
Yeah. So Kant basically said that moral norms still apply to perfectly good beings, even if they always act in accordance with those norms.
Okay.
Like the fact that they always do the right thing is explained by the fact that they're bound by the moral law, not by the fact that the moral law doesn't apply to them.
I see.
So the moral law is still the standard, even if deviation from that standard is impossible.
Interesting.
And the article concludes that there isn't really a strong philosophical reason to think that God's necessary perfect goodness would somehow make it not real moral goodness.
Okay, makes sense.
But there's another big objection to necessary perfect goodness that we need to talk about.
Which is divine freedom.
Ah, yes. The age-old question of free will.
So the concern here is that if God is necessarily perfectly good, if God literally cannot choose to do wrong, then is God truly free in moral matters?
Right, because most philosophers would say that genuine moral praise requires freedom.
Exactly. If you're forced to do the right thing, then it's not really praiseworthy.
So is God just a puppet of the moral law?
That's the worry, yeah.
Yeah.
And the article talks about this idea of significant freedom, which basically means having the real ability to do otherwise.
So you could choose to do A or you could choose to do B, and both options are genuinely possible for you.
Right. And if that's what freedom means, then a necessarily perfectly good being wouldn't be free.
Because they can only choose good.
Exactly.
So it seems like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Either God has the freedom to choose between good and evil, in which case perfect goodness might be contingent, or God is necessarily perfectly good, in which case God's freedom is questionable.
Right. It's a tough nut to crack. But there are different philosophical positions that try to navigate this dilemma.
Tell me more.
Okay, so one approach is compatibilism.
Compatibilism.
Yeah, it's the idea that free will and determinism are compatible.
So you can be free even if your actions are predetermined.
Right. And in the context of God, compatibilists might say that even if God can only choose good, God's will is still free because it's not externally constrained.
Like God isn't being forced to choose good by some outside force.
Exactly. God is the ultimate source of God's own actions.
Okay, I can see that. So it's about where the choice is coming from, not about whether there are multiple options.
Right. And the article also talks about incompatibilist views that still try to make room for necessary perfect goodness.
Incompatibilism.
Yeah, it's the opposite of compatibilism. Incompatibilists say that free will and determinism are incompatible. And some incompatibilists argue that even if freedom requires the ability to do otherwise, a being's overwhelming orientation towards the good, combined with a perfect understanding of value, could make wrongdoing practically impossible.
So it's not that God can't choose evil, it's that God would never even consider it.
Right. It'd be like me choosing to eat dirt.
Not very appealing.
Not at all. And the article mentions Aquinas' idea of the glorified in heaven as an example of this.
Like glorified in heaven.
Yeah, so Aquinas thought that once people are in heaven, they can no longer sin because they no longer see any good in sinning.
Interesting.
So maybe God's perfect understanding of value makes wrongdoing similarly unappealing.
Okay, that makes sense. So maybe God's perfect goodness doesn't require a lack of freedom. It just requires a perfect understanding of what's good.
Exactly. But the article does acknowledge that if you're really committed to the idea that freedom absolutely requires the ability to do otherwise, then necessary perfect goodness might not be possible.
Right. Which would force us to rethink either our idea of God or our idea of freedom.
Or both. Heavy stuff.
Yeah, deep philosophical waters. But there's one more piece to this puzzle that we need to address.
Which is?
The relationship between divine freedom, rationality, and necessary perfect goodness.
Right. How do those all fit together?
Because we don't want to end up in a situation where perfect rationality requires God to do something that's morally wrong, or where perfect morality requires God to do something that's irrational.
Right. We want those things to be in harmony.
Exactly. And the article mentions this idea called the strengthened rationalist thesis, which basically says that moral requirements are inherently rational requirements.
Okay, so if something is morally required, it's also rational.
Right.
Interesting.
And then there are compatibilist approaches that say, look, maybe God's fundamentally morally perfect nature is just a sufficient explanation for God's consistently good actions. So we don't need to get into all these complicated debates about the relationship between morality and rationality. We can just say that God is good because that's God's nature.
Right.
But the article also raises some concerns about this approach, right?
Yeah, like, does it really respect divine freedom if God can't even consider immoral options?
Right. And also, how do we justify moral goodness as a divine perfection if it's not connected to rationality in some way?
Yeah, those are tough questions. But they lead us to the final big question that the article tackles, and it's a real doozy.
Hit me with it.
Is moral goodness, as we humans understand it, even a pure perfection that should apply to God in the first place?
Wait, what?
Yeah, it seems obvious, right? God is perfect, so God must be morally perfect.
Right.
But the article wants us to really examine that assumption.
To question the obvious.
Exactly. And they use this analogy of a perfect frog.
A perfect frog.
Yeah, so a perfect frog has webbed toes, right?
I guess so.
But that doesn't mean that an absolutely perfect being needs to have toes at all.
Okay, I see the point. Just because something is a perfection for one kind of being doesn't mean it's a perfection for every kind of being.